Doki, are you tough? When life gives you lemons, what do you do with them? What kind of guy are you?
I'm the man who's gonna burn your house down!
When you Google the word resilience, this is the kind of stuff that comes up. Psychology, self-help, inspirational stories. But this is not how I think about resilience at all. I think about resilience in the context of disaster management, which goes a lot further than the personal and psychological. In the face of climate change and geopolitical instability and conflict and all that other bad stuff, everybody seems to be getting more and more interested in this idea of resilience. How do we build resilient water systems, power grids, infrastructure, and overall societies? It's become a linchpin for a lot of disaster management policy and practice, and that sounds great. But what do we actually mean when we say resilience? Because it is a matter of some debate. Depending on who you ask, you might get 15 different definitions of resilience, because this is an expansive word that likes to borrow from lots of different fields. If you ask a physicist, they'll say resilience describes the ability for an object to return to its normal state, like a spring relaxing. If you talk to a psychologist, they might say it's something like personal fortitude to get through tough times. If you talk to an ecologist, they'll say resilience describes how much strain an ecosystem can take before it collapses into something else. And if you ask a disaster scholar, we might glibly say that it's the ability to build back better. If resilience is becoming such an important idea, if it's really becoming a cornerstone of environmental and disaster management policy, if this is the thing that we are trying to aspire to as local and international communities, isn't it worth being on the same page? To get to what I mean by resilience in a disaster management context, first we need to understand the notion of capital. No, not that capital. Not that capital either. Well, kind of. I'm talking about Bordeaux's forms of capital. Not that Bordeaux.
Wine terms.
So in 1980-something, Pierre Bordeaux laid out a theoretical framework that basically sought to describe the types and significance of non-material resources that people have, like the power you get from your social ties.
My friends are my power.
Later, building on that work, Norris et al. Published this paper, which basically tried to translate that theory and be able to talk about not just individual resilience, but community resilience. Under this model, community resilience is understood as a network of adaptive capacities, including informational, financial, community, and social capital. If you want to read more about this, I'll have the paper in my sources, but the point here is not the theory, and believe me, there are lots of other different concepts and ideas about community resilience. The point here then is, how do we operationalize this? How do we move from theory to practice? And how does resilience as an abstract idea become an actual force that influences and changes the world that you live in, hopefully for the better? Because remember, there are no such thing as natural disasters. It is our social infrastructure, institutions, and inequalities that create the conditions that interact very badly with natural hazards like floods and fires, etc. Despite what Marjorie Taylor Greene would have you believe, we actually can't control massive destructive forces of nature like hurricanes. So this is where this stuff starts to come in. If we can't actually control and stop natural hazards from occurring, what we can do is try to control how we build and organize our societies to promote safety and resilience. It's time for a rapid-fire, grossly oversimplified disaster management history lesson. In 1755, a really bad earthquake struck Lisbon, Portugal, and the resulting damage basically destroyed most of the city, and a lot of it had to be rebuilt from scratch. Taking place during the Enlightenment, this kind of marks a turning point, or the founding of modern, at least Western, disaster management as more of a science, because instead of chalking all of this catastrophe up to the act of a wrathful Christian God, people, namely guys like the Marquis of Pombal, used this to pioneer efforts to do more systematic and deliberate recovery efforts and rebuilding of the city so that it would better withstand an earthquake next time. Fast forward, that trend continues through the 20th century when technological innovation, particularly in the realm of engineering, gave people at least the faint sense that, oh, nature, that old thing, Well, with the right builds and machinery, me and the boys, we got that under control. We can conquer nature. And this was particularly true of flooding. The Army Corps of Engineers completely rerouted and channelized the Mississippi River. The UK built tons of flood walls and tidal barriers. The Netherlands is the Netherlands. So basically, this approach seeks to use hard engineering defenses to wholly prevent floods from ever happening. There are a couple just like teeny problems with this. The first one, which could be a whole video topic on its own, is that people really didn't understand or care about the ecological impacts of doing these infrastructure builds. The second one is that, I don't know if you know this, but water is really super powerful. And now with climate change amplifying hydrological extremes, it's kind of getting more powerful in a way. So this creates a paradox. Believing certain areas that used to flood a lot are now safe because we've got these cool defensive builds put in place, people move into and develop on naturally occurring floodplains because it's nice to live close to water where you can use it to transport goods and services. That means that when those flood defenses eventually fail, either because they're poorly maintained or because they just were never built to withstand climate change hydrological extremes, the damage is worse than it otherwise would have been on a naturally occurring floodplain. Because the naturally occurring floodplain has more friction, has more permeable surface area for the water to soak into, and it's more sparsely populated. There aren't as many people living there to get hit with this stuff. In a way, doing these hard engineered defensive approaches that seek to wholly prevent floods from happening can actually make risk worse in the long term. This is all to say that we are finally starting to realize that we just can't physically build and engineer our way to a safer world. Technology can't fix everything. Instead, we have to turn to things like resilience and social adaptation to learn how to make communities that can withstand, recover from, and adapt to intense shocks. We have to learn how to live with these risks. So now we understand that trying to completely prevent disasters is not gonna work. The question then becomes, how do we build this resilience thing as a way to get through disasters instead? Let's go back to this pressure and release model that I talked about in my last video. Here, vulnerability is understood as a primary driver of risk. So, logically, if we can reduce vulnerability, we can reduce disaster risk, right? So how do you reduce vulnerability? Let's go back to this model. You might be vulnerable because you lack access to financial capital as an adaptive capacity. This is called being poor. So if we can increase your access to financial capital as an adaptive capacity, you won't have as much financial vulnerability. So your vulnerability goes down, your resilience goes up. This is understood to be an inverse relationship. So then the next question, there are lots of questions. The next question is, how do you increase those adaptive capacities? Well, this is a big thing that my disaster education focused on as well. We talked about things like citizen participation and managing diverse stakeholders, getting everybody to have a sense of ownership in these processes. We encouraged things like awareness raising and getting people to assemble go bags and get insurance and do all this other stuff. And it's not just that. Remember from my last video, there are also broader things that happen as well that even if they're not specifically targeted at disaster management, can have a knock-on effect that's beneficial. This would be things like poverty reduction measures. Those will decrease vulnerability as well. You may have noticed that a lot of those efforts have significant overlap with social justice stuff. And that is because we have robust evidence of the miserable fact that Black, brown, disabled, queer, female, and otherwise marginalized bodies bear the brunt of climate change and disaster impacts. What this means is that correcting entrenched inequalities and injustices has to be a core part of any serious attempt to reduce disaster risk. I'll say that again in case you weren't paying attention. Correcting entrenched inequalities and injustices needs to be part of serious disaster risk reduction approaches. Let's go back to my Google search results for a second. I find these interesting because they are so focused on the individual. And they're so focused on how the individual ought to pursue self-improvement as a way to cope with external stresses that the world is throwing at them. Earlier, I said that This stuff doesn't really have anything to do with the way that I think about resilience. I kind of lied to you, because what's really interesting to me is where I see this stuff overlap with disaster resilience approaches. This next part is going to get a little bit abstract, a little philosophical, but it's important, so stick with me. We have a fundamental problem with the way that we talk about social issues in the mainstream, in policy spaces, even in academia spaces. All right, to get this, we need to understand the word ontology, which basically refers to what kinds of fundamental assumptions are we making about reality. Ontology is an oft neglected but critical part of serious intellectual inquiry. If you're going to do research, if you're going to try to measure stuff and draw conclusions from that stuff, you should have some sense of what fundamental assumptions you are making about how reality even works. Otherwise, how do you know what you're looking at? How do you know what you're measuring? There are lots of ontological terms out there. This is a whole subgenre of philosophy. The two main terms that we want to get to are positivism and constructivism. Positivism in this sense does not necessarily mean like good. It's a different thing. Positivist ontologies dominate the STEM fields, the hard and natural sciences. They hold that there is an objective reality out there that we can accurately describe and measure if only we develop the right tools of inquiry. On the other end of the spectrum, constructivist ontologies declare that actually no, everything has an element of subjectivity in it. Reality is not observed, but rather interpreted and constructed through interactions. After all, none of us are alone in the universe. Everything affects everything else, and it is through these encounters with other bodies and ideas in space and time that we are changed and made. Most people, myself included, are not at either end of these extremes, but sit somewhere in the middle. However, hard sciences, and by extension positivist ontologies, tend to get privileged. This is partially because it's conceptually just a lot easier for us to subdivide things into units and break them down that way. We want to talk in terms that are concrete and quantifiable. You certainly have to if you ever want to get funding for anything. But some things just can't be measured. We don't actually live in a 100% positivist reality of only objective facts. Subjective experiences, sensations, and relationships all shape the world that we live in. They are just as real, but attempts to assign numerical values to them are always going to come up short. What this means is that when policy analysts and experts and other people come to the conclusion that basically the way to build community resilience is to increase the total percentage of resilient individuals living within a community, that's a conclusion that I would say is resting on an overly positivist ontology that fails to account for subjectivity. The logic here is anchored in the assumption that if you can make a bunch of resilient individuals and add them all up together, the sum total will be a resilient community. It's simple addition. This view treats a person as a unit of measurement, and there's an implied hierarchy here as well. Resilient individuals make up the base of the pyramid to create resilient, usually nuclear family units, to create resilient neighborhood units, to create resilient city units, to create resilient country units, to create a resilient world. But you're smart, and you've probably picked up on the fact that when you reduce something as complex as a human being into a unit of some kind of pseudo-equation, you're going to fall into problems. What's the alternative then? Well, we can look to fields like anthropology. The concept of assemblage is helpful. Ecologists turn to assemblages to get around the sometimes fixed and bounded connotations of ecological community. The question of how the varied species in a species assemblage influence each other, if at all, is never settled. Some thwart or eat each other, others work together to make life possible, still others just happen to find themselves in the same place. Assemblages are open-ended gatherings. For living things, species identities are a place to begin, but they are not enough. Ways of being are emergent effects of encounters. In other words, the world is not composed of neat, orderly, perfectly measurable boxes, and instead is this sprawling, knotted up, gnarled, tangled mess, like mycelium. Look, sometimes you do have to simplify things to be able to work with them. That's pretty much what every scientific model out there does. I'm not trying to say that math is bad or not real. I'm just pointing out that there are limitations, especially when it comes to social issues. Disasters are like 90% social issues. I bring all this up because I want you to keep in mind that there are lots of ways to view and approach these problems, some of which can have the unintended consequence of flattening, ignoring, or even discouraging diversity. Our next question as we dig into this is, okay, when you reduce people to units, what kind of units are we talking about? Efforts to promote resilience often forget, or at least gloss over, the fact that actually being called upon to be resilient to get through a really difficult time sucks and is really hard. And it's usually not a fair ask. This is the first problem, which honestly is not so much a gripe I have with resilience as much as it is a larger problem with climate change in general, because a lot of the easy choices that we could have made decades ago are off the table. How fair is it to ask people to be individually responsible for how well they thrive in climate and disaster impacts? What role should the state have? What kind of sacrifices are reasonable to expect and from whom? What are the wealthy sacrificing? Is vulnerability always a bad thing? I don't think you have to have gone through marriage counseling to know that the answer is no. Sometimes we need to be vulnerable. I'm going to need any alpha bros out there watching to chill out for a second because I'm about to bring in feminist theory. Here's a very broad summary of a lot of complex critical theory stuff. First, we are all vulnerable. That is part of the human condition, that we can get hurt, we can be injured, and we can die. There's only so much control that we have over our own bodies, and we are dependent on other people who can hurt us. That kind of, let's call it primary vulnerability, is core to the experience of being a person. And its potential can run both ways. Just as your primary vulnerability means that you can be hurt, it also means that you can be helped. I mean, think of a time when you've been sick or upset about something and someone came to your aid. Being rendered vulnerable also gives you an opportunity for genuine human connection. But obviously, that primary vulnerability can lead to harm when it is exploited or abused. We all have needs. And when those needs are thwarted deliberately or negligently by systems of power, that's when we run into issues with oppression and marginalization. Those are the things that leave certain groups excessively vulnerable to disaster impacts. And it can be tempting to think that the way to fix this secondary or excessive vulnerability is to make people more self-reliant, to make them resistant to having their needs thwarted in the first place, to minimize the exposure that their primary vulnerability gives them to others. But what about the systems and the people that do the exploiting and abusing? I have to ask if we're focusing on the right thing there. A project that seeks to eliminate vulnerability is a project that seeks to transform diverse people into, I have a quote, self-reliant, rational, independent, a priorically adult, and archetypically masculine liberal subjects. In other words, it's a project to make everybody as close as possible to the default white, able-bodied male. It's a project that attempts to help by smoothing out all the inconvenient bumps and edges and unique characteristics that make people varied and diverse. So this is when resilience as a policy goal, I think, can become problematic. The creating resilient individuals approach puts the onus entirely on individual people, and it becomes a way for governments and powerful actors to totally abdicate their responsibility to look after people's safety and well-being. The cost gets passed down to us, literally. This is what gets called disaster capitalism. Disaster resilience becomes a pay-to-survive system where the wealthy get to jet off on their luxury evacuation airlines or scuttle away into their secret bunkers on private islands, and the rest of us are left holding the bag. A really exaggerated form of this problem is embodied by extreme doomsday preppers. By the way, I have been working for a while on a script that's just a deep dive analysis of doomsday preppers, so that will eventually be a thing that I post here. Doomsday preppers purchase and hoard massive stockpiles of supplies in order to ensure that their individual family or household units survive catastrophic events. Scholars Emily Ray and Robert Kirsch, thanks for sending me your paper by the way, describe this phenomenon as bunkerization. As the post neoliberal world degrades, adapts, or reifies itself in everyday life, it makes sense that individuals are compelled to take matters of survival into their own hands by demonstrating consumer savvy and by rejecting the choice to see their exposure and futures as collectively linked. We theorize this process as bunkerization, an individual responsibility to prepare for apocalyptic threats by recongruing the domestic space of everyday life through mass consumption. Okay, I take your point, but isn't individual preparedness and resilience better than nothing? I mean, governments are abandoning people. Privatization is running amok and destroying public services that would otherwise build community resilience, if that's what you're saying would be better. Some governments are actively hostile to their own people or even weaponize disaster aid. So, with nobody else to look out for them, what do you expect people to do? Are you really going to tell folks that they shouldn't try to be prepared on their own for emergencies because of what? Some anti capitalist principle? Wait, where did you come from? Oh, well, you're doing YouTube now. So obviously, you need to present a dialogue with an alternate version of yourself to present counter arguments so that you can address them in a format that's more interesting than just reading stuff off like an essay. Don't worry, Plato did it. It's super prestigious. Oh, okay. Well, anyway, other me, you do make a good point. And it's not really rational to expect people to not prepare for anything out of some abstract beef with neoliberalism. And this is something that I often feel conflicted about. In that same paper, Kirsch and Ray criticize the CERT program as contributing to bunkerization. The home becomes the center of security and survival, and the state is merely an informational resource but not a guarantor of safety. Emblematic of this approach is that FEMA maintains a training manual for a Community Emergency Response Team, CERT, of its Citizen Corps, which is predicated on the idea that, in an emergency, public services may not be readily available, and that preparedness comes from community leaders and grassroots organizations. While having knowledge of first aid triage dispersed through a community is an unobjectionable project, the notion of deputizing people to fill the gaps in public services is part of the trajectory of hardening the home against perceived threats that loom on the horizon and an evident neoliberal value. The individual is self responsible and can participate in community preparation, but is only obligated to account for themselves. Well, not only have I participated in that program, I have heartily recommended it to others, and I still do. But Kirsch and Ray make a really good point here. Even as they admit that sharing preparedness knowledge with community members is, like, good, it is troubling to watch states increasingly abdicate their responsibilities. And what that means is that private markets are able to step into the gap that they leave behind to sell their tricked out survival gear. Okay, and look, even in a just, honest, perfect world with a benevolent government, this would still be a problem. Disasters, by their very nature, disrupt and incapacitate supply lines, logistics, transport, and yes, first responders. So, logistically, it's just not really reasonable to expect people to not have to shoulder any of that burden by themselves, even if it's just temporarily. However, the idea that disaster resilience, preparedness, recovery, response, all of it, is either solely on the state or solely on the individual is a false dichotomy that we can reject because remember, we're trying to move away from rigid boxes of thinking. We can explore alternative models. Everything that I've outlined here becomes a problem when resilience is broken down to just the individual or household unit, and then those units are presumed to be building blocks for resilient communities. It's not that I object to having individuals who are resilient or households that are resilient. Those are fine. Those are good and helpful things. I want to object to the building block part and the way that we can reduce some of this to simple addition and subtraction and accidentally flatten out or ignore diverse characteristics. Which means I have to talk about the gays and really every marginalized group that has ever had to advocate for themselves by extension. The HIV/AIDS pandemic was a tragic example of poor disaster management by a government that was negligent at best or actively hostile at worst. Thanks, Reagan. Left not only to fend for themselves but defend themselves, queer communities across North America often had to develop their own informal support networks of care. They were following a long line and history of mutual aid projects in the United States. Take the Black Panthers, for example. Is this kind of collective community care a viable path for resilience then? Well, it has its limits. Mutual aid projects are often done by people who are already marginalized, oppressed, who don't have access to a lot of resources, and who are already exhausted just from getting through the day to day. HIV/AIDS groups did a lot of critical work when it came to resisting social death and putting pressure on politicians to act. But they couldn't do things like fund and run their own research facilities. They couldn't develop the medical treatments on their own that would eventually let HIV become survivable. And yet, I do think there's something here that's worth exploring. Instead of siloing individuals to use their personal wealth or consumer savvy to protect themselves, instead, here, shared characteristics that can make people excessively vulnerable are recognized. And that recognition of shared vulnerability then becomes the bedrock for building informal community networks of care and solidarity. Here, then, is one alternative option to the neoliberal approach where resilience is understood not as a static quality to own or possess, but as a community capacity to share. And look, my thesis here is not that mutual aid is the silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems. I'm sorry. There are no panaceas when it comes to this stuff. Climate change, disasters, all of it. These solutions are patchwork and context dependent, and there are always trade-offs. But I do think we need to be able to imagine and explore things beyond what we're used to and what we assume. My point is that we can and should ask for more than individual resilience building projects. We should be exploring what it means to have collective resilience, and to do so in a way that doesn't flatten out or disparage diversity. And I would like to challenge my peers and colleagues in the disaster studies and management space to really take a close look at your assumptions about social vulnerability and about resilience, because the whole point of the work that we do is to try to make the world better. And I think that's kind of hard to do if we end up just rebuilding using the same structures and ideologies that got us into the climate crisis in the first place. All right. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, all of that fun stuff. Let me know what you thought of this in the comments, and feel free to give me suggestions for other topics that you would like me to explore in the future. See you next time.